good afternoon. Welcome to Courageous Conversations, Sense-Making Conversations for Friday, June the 5th. Glad that you guys are here. And this really is a continuation of our conversation about race in the world, race of what's happening in the United States, and specifically how it impacts us here in Toronto, Canada. Today I have an amazing guest. His name is Dwayne Matthews, which I will be introducing in just a moment. But what I wanted to do is just sort of give everyone a little bit of a recap as to what we discussed yesterday. And it was really about being a anti-racist activist and the difference between being non-racist and a anti-racist activist. And really just about calling people out when you see something happening that's not right, whether it be within your friends, family, communities, workplace, or even in the government. So really we chatted about some statistics, and we also talked about having a personal examination of yourself and what you can do in order for your word to affect change, whether it's your word, your good deed, sometimes even the dollar that you earn, and what businesses you support. So we're all about change. It's a topic that's not always comfortable to talk about, but change doesn't necessarily come when you're comfortable. You got to be uncomfortable to sort of shake up the status quo in society. So today we're going to be talking about systemic racism in the education space. And who I have here today is Dwayne Matthews. And Dwayne Matthews is a Chief Innovation Evangelist and a Future of Education Strategist. He's an expert. He helps educators and parents understand the new and evolving themes in the 21st century. He is the future of work and how to prepare children to thrive in a rapidly evolving digital information-driven world. I mentioned he's an expert, and it's proven by countless awards, one of which he's the recipient of the BAIE Trailblazer and Innovation Award. That was presented to him by the CIO at BMO. Dwayne, we are so happy to have you. Welcome. How are you doing? Make sure you unmute.
There we go. How's that?
That works just perfect. How you doing?
Thank you very much. It's been a pretty busy time. As a lot of people are out there having all different kinds of situations. I have a 10-year-old and a 2-year-old. Both my wife and I are on back-to-back Zoom meetings, and so managing all those things has been pretty busy. And then of course, you know, we had a pretty big week last week. A lot of things to reflect on top of COVID-19. So far, 2020 has been pretty interesting.
It's been interesting to say the least. Challenging and adversity is really definitely going to be a year that we remember. But let's just jump right into it in terms of the events, what happened last week. The George Floyd murder impacted the world, impacted the Black community, and then as Black men, what I mentioned yesterday in yesterday's webinar, the knee was sort of like a metaphor. It just felt like no matter how successful we are, no matter how positive we may be, it feels like there's a knee from the oppressor. So my first question to you is, what impact did last week's event with George Floyd impact you as a Black man?
So, you know, it's been a really reflective week. As you know, you mentioned before, it may not necessarily feel like it matters. You know, what we've achieved so far and what we've done, that, you know, we're still having these kinds of conversations today. But I think that the first thing that I felt was terribly sad. It made me really, really sad that we had to see that. And the other thing that I felt was very traumatized. You know, someone sent the video to me, and I didn't necessarily know what I was about to look at. So I wasn't prepared for it. I thought it was, an arrest that I was going to see, and I had no idea that, you know, that I was preparing myself to see really an execution of someone. And I think a lot of people had to take some time and really sit back and ingest just the trauma of witnessing something like that, and then adding it onto the fact that you felt that it was connected somehow to skin color and to the way that we look, and all those kinds of pieces. And one of the challenges that I think, or reflections that I had, was really starting to think about Dwayne as the individual, observing it and experiencing it. Dwayne as the Trinidadian Canadian, observing it and experiencing it. Dwayne as a Black male, you know, as defined outside by society, experiencing it. And I think all of those things were very overwhelming. It was very overwhelming to try and piece all that together. And then the overwhelming sensation, you know, there was a sense of refocus, and there was a sense of anger. There was a sense of sadness and rage. There's a sense of confusion around what kind of conversation do I have with my son? You know, what kind of conversations do I entertain? How do I set up boundaries around myself to sort of maintain a certain level of mental fortitude while I went through and processed the whole experience? So in a short, it was an extremely complex and tiring week for me as a person. I really thought it was very, very exhausting to reflect on the situation. And I reflected on that exhaustion and the impact that it had.
I totally understand, and I could totally relate. Before I ask you my next question, for the audience, if you guys have a question, feel free to throw it in the chat or the Q&A bubble. But you mentioned having a conversation with your son. I was watching CNN, and they actually interviewed one of the Black business owners in Minneapolis, and he had a 6-year-old at home, and he considers himself a man of integrity. He likes to be a straight shooter. The CNN anchor asked, "How did you explain this to your son?" And his voice got foggy, and he said, "You know what, I gotta be very honest with you, I lied. I tell him, I don't know what to tell him." He just said that I just tell him some bad things are happening, but he didn't want to take away from his son's childhood. His child was 6. You said your son is 10. How have you been able to make sense of it with your own son?
So that's a really interesting question. And as an educator, one of the things that I understand is, as a society, really, we sort of need 3 themes running in the background consistently. And one of those themes is confidence, trust, and optimism. So there's usually some balance of those. And I mean, if you think about it in the grand scheme of things, I like to try and think about where things are connected. But you know, if you think of a stock market is literally based on those 3 concepts. There's confidence in the market. There's trust in the market, and that trust is built in not because, you know, this person believes that they're a good person, but because there are systems in place that sort of enhance a certain amount of trust. Companies have to report a certain way. And then there's optimism. There's always optimism built into the market, in that, you know, people believe that the market is consistently going to grow up. Even if it's having a down moment, it's going to come back at some point into the future. And those are really important concepts for society, for cultures, and for people. They're extremely important for children. And so, you know, how do I explain something to him that has to do with someone far away that will impact him, will impact how people may see him, and what may impact how he thinks about himself, without removing confidence in who he is, without removing trust in the safety institutions around him, his teachers, his parents, you know, the police, and optimism about what his future is going to be. So I really have to manage, you know, how I unveil the truth to him, because those things are important. as a group, we're sort of in a double bind. Most people will tell you, as they experienced this and they felt the confidence about progress ripped away, they felt the trust ripped away and exposed by an institution that's really there to provide safety, to give a sense of safety. But being able to see that sort of on display, it reminds one of that lack of trust. And then the struggle to maintain hope, right? And to hope for what? And so even us, we're in a double bind because if we turn a blind eye and say we just want to grab onto these things and we don't see them and we don't address them and deal with them directly, it's detrimental. It's detrimental to changing things. It's detrimental to making the kind of impact and the long-lasting impact. But at the same time, if those three things are ripped away, we'll find that our productivity goes down. Our ability to dream gets cut off. We'll find that instead of thinking about what our future is going to be and how we would like to make the future better, we start looking right at our feet and we start contemplating the place that we're in. We start contemplating the injustices. And, it's important for us to do that. And so it makes it very, very difficult. It's a very, very complex situation. How do we maintain hope, trust, and confidence while we deal with the fact that a lot of hope, trust, and confidence is fictitious or is lacking for people that look like us, and that's a really, really challenging thing to come to terms with. It's very, very difficult, and I sort of look back at the historical connections, and I actually marvel at how far we've come since 1965. Right? I mean, we're not talking about that long ago. We're stretching back to 400, 450 years ago, up till 1965. And it's a very, very profound reflection.
Definitely is. Can you tell me about a time that you've experienced racism as a Black professional yourself?
When, like yesterday or recently?
It's not funny yet we laugh, right?
Yeah, no, and I mean, it's and again, these are defense mechanisms that we create to protect ourselves, protect ourselves from some of the reality that we feel. I was explaining to somebody yesterday, I go, we take a lot of things and we attempt to compartmentalize them to keep us going. We attempt to put them into bottles so we can be progressive. We attempt to normalize, to minimize, the sensation. And I mean, these sensations, they're connected directly to our brain. Our prefrontal cortex, the part that feels like us, is thinking about who we are and aspirations. But if we believe that we're in danger, let me back up a bit. If you can imagine a brain to be a 3-story house. The basement is sort of what controls your liver, your lungs, your breathing, the things that you don't really control. The first floor is where the kitchen is. And in the first floor, you have a stove. And by that stove, you have an alarm. And on the 3rd floor is where the brain is. So if you're up there on the 3rd floor, the brain is where your study is. And all of a sudden you hear an alarm and you run downstairs. You don't know if the kitchen's on fire or if it's just a rice grain in the burner. And the impact of that, if you just thought about it, if that alarm kept on going off 2-3 times a day, and you had to run downstairs 2-3 times a day to see, is the kitchen on fire or is it a rice grain? The impact of that over 55 years, the impact of that over 400 years, and you pass that up through generations from family to family, and you now come out here, you start to realize that impact is actually quite profound. So myself, when did the alarms go off? Well, sometimes it's a rice grain. I'm walking into the LCBO, and this is before COVID-19, and there's a police officer. I live in a reasonably nice neighborhood. never ever felt anything, but this police officer decides to overtly follow me all through the store. So, you know, is this police officer following me because he just happens to be going on my path? Do I look like someone else? Is it a rice grain or a fire? I don't know, but I consistently have to think about it all the time, every single day. And so it's very, very difficult. A lot of people, as we're sitting in the house right now in COVID-19, if you have children, imagine when you're trying to focus and work and somebody's screaming at the door, somebody's crying downstairs and you don't know, and you have to run down and come back up. Think about how exhausting the last 2 months have been. And now extend that across my entire 46 years, and then extend that back 500 years, 450 years before that.
Got it. Let's pivot to systemic racism in education. How do you see that taking root, and what impact do you think that's having on students, especially students under 20? I know you got a 10-year-old son, but the students that you see in the education space.
Yeah. So I really tried to explain systemic racism, and it's difficult. You know, someone will say, "Well, Dwayne, is it that that teacher just had a problem with that student? Does it necessarily have to do with race? You know, how is that all put together?" And so, you know, if I could just spend a couple minutes and maybe attempt to do a pretty rough, shoddy job at connecting the dots across time, and then get right to that question. And if you'll permit me, John, you know, we're here in COVID-19, and what makes COVID-19 really profound is that it's a virus that human beings have never come into contact with. So it's not necessarily how dangerous is the virus, it's the fact that it's a virus that human beings have come into contact with that we haven't come into contact with before, and it makes it particularly dangerous. And why do we think that? Well, in 1492, a group of Europeans turned up in the Americas. And as they were looking around, they came with lots of animals. And some of those animals ran off into the bushes. And they took with them the flu. And the flu, when it's met with a lot of the indigenous peoples, were wiped out through colonization, through violence, but a much larger portion was wiped out through the diseases that were passed along through those animals, the flu specifically. And that was because they had never come into contact with that, okay? And so as that decimates that entire civilization, we now have a group of people that are trying to develop all of the Americas, and they think, well, what can we do? Well, you know, we need labor. So we go back and we get labor. And so we start thinking, where can we find this labor? So we find labor through the form of slavery. Now, slavery was consistent in Africa, but it wasn't scaled and it wasn't systematic. And so now we start having that process. And in the beginning of that process, someone starts to realize, you know what, this is pretty terrible what we're doing. The way that we're treating these people, the inhumane way that we're transporting them. And, you know, some of our viewers can go online and have a look at those pictures. Just to look at the ship and contemplate how long it would take to come from Western Africa and sail across to the Caribbean and land in Jamaica by sail. And then look at the pictures. And so they start to think, we need to have a justification. And when I say they, I'm speaking specifically of the traders, not entire groups, because I don't look at any group as a monolithic structure, right? And which is really, really important. And so as they have this justification, that justification, they have to dehumanize the same way that we attempt to dehumanize things that are at a distance to us. And so they have to dehumanize the human beings and that particular experience. Now, if you do that for 400 years across time, you really have to bake that into your subconscious. You have to bake that into the culture, because how else can a culture look and understand what's happening and just have it normalize into the culture? And so as that happens, now you're thinking 700,000 slaves a year, right? Floating through Jamaica and then coming. And then all of those slaves, if you can imagine, are coming from different tribes, different people, small places. And all of a sudden they get through, and as they land, they're no longer Igbo, they're no longer from Benin, Togo, right? They just have to be Black, Negro, right? So if you try and think of a group that is specifically defined as a monolithic structure around color. Try and think of a group. I was really trying very hard and I couldn't find any, right? Even when you look at, these sort of constructions, all the different groups that you can think about that have been persecuted over time, right? You can give a name to that group in terms of an identifier, right? But there are no specific identifiers across that 400-year period, right? We're just left with a construct, Black, and that construct was very, very specific. So as that construct now comes in, and here we are at 1863 around, and the slaves start to be freed, and now those people enter into the space. The justification is still baked in across 400 years, right? And so now all of a sudden, these people that look like us end up in schools, and they end up in schools, and some are disadvantaged. Some are not disadvantaged, but we really don't know, right? Because there's not enough nuance in terms of how we identify. So we create this monolithic structure and we bake it in. So someone says to me, how do we help Black boys? I'm like, which ones? Right? So it's very, very hard. And so that bakes in to a systematic view. We're inside of a systematic construction that has a systematic view, and that systematic view is based on a negative color, which has certain attributes. Between 1965 and now, we've attempted to grab that negative attribute and turn it into something positive. But if it's baked in across all that time, then it's part of a systematic construction. And if it's part of a systematic construction, then the suffering or injustices that are felt across time and space are part of that systematic construction. Therefore, you have systematic racism baked into schools. And it's not necessarily something that a teacher may think of as the surface. As the surface is, I never called anybody a name, and I don't have any problem with this particular group per se. But my question always is to educators and to people that are non-Black to say, if you had the opportunity, would you want your child, your non-Black child, to be treated the way that you think that a young Black boy would be treated? If the answer is no, then you understand that there's systematic racism going across education.
100%. And you mentioned your values are confidence, trust, and optimism. So if we were to have to look forward with hope as our lens, what do you think can be done to affect change?
So I think this is a two-pronged question. And the first part is we would have to identify very specific, immediate injustices that we would have to address. And we would have to put in, almost artificial interventions, right? Like I mentioned before about economy, and I don't know very much about economy, but there's this concept called quantitative easing. And quantitative easing is an artificial intervention to protect the economy. And so we would have to put in effective artificial interventions. But more importantly, I think what we would have to do is we really would have to focus on how do we make sense of the world around us. So a lot of schooling has to do with content consumption. And it has to do with content consumption because of the cutting edge 600-year-old technologies that we use, which is a book. Most people don't realize that a book is technology, but it is technology, and we've built entire systems around it, and it's allowed us to do very amazing things. But within the book, the content itself is consumed and memorized. And so that's really, really important. What's happened is most of us, we haven't learned how to actually look at information and interrogate it and think about different perspectives. So I think on a deeper level, after the initial interventions, we're going to really have to train our students and ourselves as educators to really start thinking about how do we create question frameworks to allow us to interrogate what we see, to allow us to question it. We're stuck, we're all stuck sort of in this great pause, the great pause of 2020, and it's made us very reflective. And so we've started to reflect on a lot of different structures that we have, you know, very simple things. Do I actually need to drive to work every 2 hours? Do I need to spend 2 hours in the car, or can I work from home? You know, do I know my family or do I not? You know, do I like my family or do I not? You know, let's think about climate change. And now all of a sudden this week is, let's have a really hard look at racism. And so how do we start to reflect on that? And I think that's the piece that I don't necessarily hear a lot of, because I understand the artificial interventions have to come first. And that's the piece that people have a really hard time with. You know, very much like quantitative easing. Some people don't want the money to be printed, but it's the same thing. We have to put these interventions to keep people safe. And then we have to get to the next level and have real honest conversations and ask ourselves really hard questions. And not necessarily just non-Black people. Black people as well. We have to ask ourselves really hard questions about how do we strategically move forward. I don't have the answers to all those questions, but I'm pretty confident that that's the process. And if we have that process, we'll develop a certain level of trust and we'll develop a certain level of optimism.
Absolutely. You mentioned economics, and there's a hot debate happening right now. I saw Justin Trudeau get asked this question a couple of days ago on the podium. And the question is, what do you think about defunding police and redirecting some of that money into disadvantaged communities? What's your take on that?
So, you know, that's a really tricky question, and I'm almost prepared to give you the 21-second pause as I reflect on it. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about that. There's a relationship between policing, and spaces. And some of those spaces are defined by economics. Some of those spaces are defined by racialized interpretations. Some of those spaces are defined by a combination of both. And that's a very difficult thing to think about. You know, I was spent probably the first half of my life in Trinidad and Tobago, and I've had lots of negative interactions with the police there. And this is where police officers look just like me, the whole force. And so, but it's amplified here, right? It's amplified in a way, and there's obviously nuance to it. And now it's even more amplified because we can see it. And what was quite shocking, I think, with the situation in Minnesota, and I do have a connection to Minnesota that I'll mention if we have time. But one of the things that was shocking was, you know, first the 9 minutes, but not just the 9 minutes, the fact that the officer was reasonably comfortable to the fact that he was being taped, reasonably comfortable with the fact that it was probably going to be broadcasted on the internet. He was reasonably comfortable after Mr. Floyd stopped moving. And that level of comfort is concerning. It's very, very concerning if a systemized group believes that what they're doing is justifiable and defensible. And I think we really have to sit back and reflect on that. Now, in terms of defunding police, I don't know.
And it doesn't have to be an either or.
Yeah, no, I don't know. And it's, there's a really great thinker named Ray Dalio, and he wrote a pretty interesting book. And he says, if you're faced with a situation that seems either or, perhaps you need to slow down and really think about it some more. And I think we really have to think about what are the options that we have on the table.
Absolutely. What we'll do is we could go and keep this conversation going But there are a couple of questions from the panelists. I would love to hear from them. And there's actually one that's already out. And it's really comes from one of our panelists. It says from My Lamb, and it says, "Are there any strategies to share on teaching at mainly white populated schools and speaking to younger children on racism?"
Yeah, so I would say that, you know, I could sit back and I could give you a list of 5 things, you know, maybe you could do, right? Like I could tell you, you know, you got to think mirror window is a good one, right? So people need to see themselves, and people need to reflect on what they're seeing. But I think what's really important is for teachers and educators to really reflect on where they see themselves sitting on this issue at first. So the first is, it's jarring. It's absolutely shocking. It's moved the entire world, really. Anybody that's had a chance to see this has been impacted and moved. You know, we looked at huge demonstrations all over the world. But I think what's really important is to think about not necessarily having the answers, but to start having honest conversations and allowing children to have those honest conversations. One of the problems that we face is that we attempt to create a construction and download it into a child. And if we're right about treating people a certain way, then we can be pretty confident that if we know how to think with the right kinds of frameworks, we'll come to that conclusion. So I think, you know, immediately in terms of teaching, the first thing that I would say to educators is, what bucket do you fit in? Are you in the kind of serious bucket? Are you in the serious bucket? Or are you in the very serious bucket? And I don't know which bucket you fit in, and only a person's gonna know that to themselves. And once you figure that out, then you start thinking about, okay, let's just say I'm in the very serious bucket. Where do I go look? Right? Where do I go look? How do I start looking, and where do I find that information? If you're in the very serious bucket, you know, you'll think maybe asking my 2 Black friends is not enough, because they can't speak for an entire phenotypical group that has multiple narratives and a number of nuances within that group. The African American experience is significantly different than the Canadian American experience. It's significantly different from the Caribbean, Canadian, maybe American experience. It's significantly different from the African that just came from Africa experience. And so there's many different narratives and many different nuances. And so I would say to start finding that mirror and window and start realizing first that there are nuances. You're not speaking about one monolithic group of people that go to a meeting every night and discuss and come out with, you know, these are the 10 things that we will tell our friends that are non-Black, right? Like, so that's really important. But if you, let's just say you wanted to have one first starting point, the first thing that I would say is there's a video that was done a long time ago. It's called Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes. And if you haven't seen it, look up that video and look at the whole story and look at the impact. And once you look at that impact, then connect that to 400 years backwards and then start to reflect on how would I approach that, right? How would I approach that? So like I said, you can go grab 5 books and, you know, maybe check some boxes and cover it off. If you're in the kind of serious, if you're in the serious box, I would grab that Brown Eyes, Blue Eyes first. And if you're in the really serious, then I would think about the reflection and how you create questions to start that reflection.
Great call to action. And just as you mentioned, there are many narratives coming out of what happened with George Floyd. You have some people that are outraged by police brutality. You have other people that are outraged by the riots and the looting, the way how people are protesting and not the reason why they're protesting. I had someone mention, well, why didn't someone jump in and save George Floyd when, and more concerned about shooting the video, but the police were holding that person off and the bystanders. But so you can see there's a lot of different perspectives. Right now, I think we have time for one more question. Toronto is currently preparing for many protests, not all to do with Black Lives Matter, but if you walk up and down Yonge Street or Bloor Street, all the stores are boarded up. They are preparing themselves just in case. My final question to you, Dwayne, is what message do you have for young people as they are looking to get their voices heard and protesting in the streets of Toronto today?
Yeah, so while it's not justifiable, I understand when rage is unleashed from a bottle. I also understand that these situations are complex. So a lot of the violence or vandalism in the US was not specifically around people that may have been protesting for that specific purpose. Some of it may have been, some of it may not. I think it's important for people to, A, put things into pieces, express themselves, right? So come out, protest, express yourself. I think that's very, very important. The second piece is to work really hard to transform that anger post-expression into action. So what can you control? What can you not control? And reflecting, do you have all the components under your control so you know what they are? And then can you put a lot of that energy into that, right? How do you do that? But in terms of the expression of anger and protest, I think it's people's right to protest. I think they have a right to do that if they see an injustice. It's one of the mechanisms that we have in our society. And I think they should do that. I think people should go out and express themselves. But I also think that people should start thinking about what's the call to action after, right? How can I use this energy and direct it and focus it? What is the common north that we can find to point into and put lots of our energy there, right? How do I make sure that I balance between dealing with racism, attempting to change the system, but I also balance making sure that I also remain focused and moving forward and sharpening the tools of my brain to be able to create the kind of impact that I want. It's really important not to get lost in the rage. It's really important to think about, how do I move forward? How do I become better? You know, and I also think to the people that are there that are non-Black, that are going down to express their rage, to think about, what part can I do consistently, right? So it's great. I loved waking up on Tuesday and seeing all the Black screens. I love all the messages. I appreciate the phone calls from people calling in, but what can I do consistently that'll be impactful? How do I keep this in view, right? What can I do consistently as we go through this huge time of reflection? I'm very optimistic because I think this is a great time of reflection as people contemplate many injustices, inefficiencies, and components of our society that are ineffective. I was saying to someone that 2014 as a species may have been one of our best years on record, right? We had a record number of people that left poverty. We had a record number of girls that were in school. We had the lowest amount of people that were hungry. We had the least amount of conflicts on the planet. And somehow we took that for granted. We didn't have it in our view. And here we are a few years later, and we have this opportunity to reflect. And so to non-Black people and to Black people to think about, what are the opportunities and how can I keep that consistent? How do we move from substitution to modification to transformation? I would definitely spend some time reflecting on that.
Awesome. And it goes for not just education space, which is where we start our focus, but that just goes for a society as a whole. Do me a favor, hug your son, your daughter, your wife. It was so great speaking to you. We go back years. My brother says hello. You went to college. You went to University of Windsor with Chev.
Right.
He says hello. So I'll be talking to you again. But we'll make sure that we have a recording link so people can watch it later if they weren't able to catch the whole session. But I so appreciate your time. Thank you, Dwayne.
Listen, thank you very much for having me. You know, I appreciate you having these conversations. And, you know, like you said, I was speaking with my wife and I said, gosh, we've known John and Siobhan such a long time. And one thing that, you know, we both wanted to say that we really appreciate, you know, you always spend so much time making sure that you put out such a positive energy, and that's been really consistent for all the years that I've known you. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate this opportunity. Thank you.
Virtual hug. All right, I'll catch you later.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.